Bienvenidos, Ushamdi, and welcome to this Hut8 networking Techtorial, where we're going to continue our conversation about basic ASA installation and configuration. And so Module 3 is going to focus on initial ASA configuration tasks. So let's go ahead and dive in here. Now, we're going to be looking at 3 different methods and ways to configure the ASA. The first method is going to be using the interactive configuration prompts. And if we were to transition here over to the command line, you can see that we've actually seen this before, where we erased the configuration, reloaded the ASA, and now the ASA comes up asking us, would you like to pre-configure the firewall now through interactive prompts? Now, this is going to be the easiest approach because it's actually going to be prompting us for the information required. Now, a quick note, you can see that we had this error migration, could not get the startup config, and that's because it's been erased. And here we have the saving startup errors, right? Remember these upgrade startup error files that you can get rid of because they're being generated due to the fact that there is no startup config. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to answer yes here. Now, it's going to ask me about the firewall mode. Do I want it to be routed, or I would put in transparent? Now, we want the firewall to be routed mode. We'll talk about the differences between routed mode and transparent mode a little later on. But for right now, let's just keep it simple. We'll say routed mode. The password for enable mode or privilege exec is going to just be ABC123. We definitely want to allow password recovery. Let's take a look at the times here and the date, and that is correct. And we've got 0054, so let's change this to 1222:45. And so we'll set our time to 1222:45 along with that system clock we're looking at. Now, the management IP address. This is going to be related to the ASA. This is not the management IP of a PC somewhere, right? This is the management IP address of the ASA because it's going to create for us a management interface on the ASA that's going to allow me to manage this device. So the management IP, I'm going to say, we'll keep it simple. We'll say 192.168.1.1. Now, the management network mask, again, we'll keep it simple, a /24. The host name, we'll just call this ASA-02. Domain name, CCNA, security.com. IP address of host running the device manager. So we're not actually going to have a dedicated host. We're just going to use a web browser, so we can leave that blank. Now you'll notice it's going to prompt me and ask me, hey, do you want to save this to flash? We absolutely do. Now, there is that management interface. Now, the security level, you can see it said set to 0. This means it's the most unsecure interface with a level of 0. And it's simply just named, and we'll see the name if command as management. So here we are, we've got our host name in there, the configuration has been saved. So let's go from user exec to privilege exec, ABC123, and let's say show run. So let's begin to take a look at some of the ASA configuration. And let's draw the pin tool out here. So you can see that we've got the host name, right? Here's our domain name. The enable password has been encrypted. And we've got some translate information here, and we'll come back to that when we get into a little more advanced configuration. So Ethernet interface 00 is shut down. And again, here's this interface VLAN 1, and there's the name interface, right? And we have to name the interface when we get into the inside, outside, and management, or else we're not going to be able to reach that interface. You can see the security level has been set to 0. Now, by default, interfaces are in VLAN 1, and so that's why it's kind of odd here, right? When we look at this, we see that this Ethernet 00 interface is shut down. However, when we look at Ethernet 01 through 07, they're not shut down. And this is always one of those little semantical quirky things with iOS or the ASA operating system is you'll notice it doesn't have a statement here that says switch port access VLAN 1 on any of these interfaces here, and they're all up. All of these interfaces are up. So why does it not have switch port access VLAN 1? Exactly, because that is the default. So by default, Ethernet 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, they are all members of VLAN 1. So I could take a PC and I could plug that PC into any of these Ethernet interfaces, and they would be members of the management VLAN. And as long as they sit on that subnet right there, 192.168.1.0/24, I would be able to communicate with the ASA from the management interface. So again, 1 through 7, Ethernet 0, 1 through 0, 7 are all by default not shut down and members of VLAN 1. So you're probably thinking, well, wait a second, why is Ethernet 00 shut down? So it too is a member of VLAN 1, but it is shut down because typically what's going to happen is Ethernet 00 is going to be your outside interface, which obviously would not be a member of management, right? We would typically call that interface outside. So what we're seeing here is the interactive prompts are nice, right? They give us this management VLAN allowing me to plug into Ethernet 0, 1 through 7, and then I would be able to do some common configuration tasks. And let me clear that. Hold on one second here. So I'd be able to do some common configuration tasks, but again, we don't have any outside connectivity here because Ethernet 00, it's shut down. There is no VLAN 2 or VLAN 3, etc. Right? So we can see, let's take a look at some of these other basic configurations here. We've got our, we've got our domain name, right? We set that to ccnasecurity.com. And so it gives us some basic configuration information, and let's see what else we've got here. And we set something else. Where did we set it? No, we didn't set much of anything else. All right, so then we've got our class map and our policy map. When we get into oops, I'll come all the way up here. When we get into the modular policy framework, right, or the MPF, we're going to come back and talk about the class map, the policy map global policy, which is referring to that class map inspection default. So you can see we've got some basic settings here. So the problem is that while it's given us some basic settings, and that's pretty much it, right? It's given us some basic settings, but it hasn't really given us the ability to plug in and get connectivity. We have no outside interface. We've got no inside interface. We just simply have this management interface that's been configured, right? So let's say, and we'll transition back here to our slide deck. So let's say that the interactive configuration prompt, that's definitely the easiest way to get going. We're going to get prompted for basic settings that are going to allow me to then go ahead and connect or communicate with the ASA. But what if we wanted to do a little bit more than that, right? So that's where we would take a look at method 2. And so here's where you can do what's called the factory default approach. And it's actually quite straightforward and quite simple. We simply issue the configure factory-default command. And we do that from global config, and this is going to overwrite everything in the configuration. And it's a great way to see some of the more advanced settings that you would need. And again, it's very easy to do. So let's make that happen here. Let's jump back onto this ASA. So we've done this and we decide, you know what, this is not working for me. So I'm going to get into global config by typing config T. I'll say no, we don't want to provide any of that information, and then configure factory default. I'm going to hit enter, and this is the thing. When you type that command, this is not a command that you want to type on an operational ASA thinking that you can bail out. When you type that command, it's going to go ahead and show us what the changes are. So now remember I referenced VLAN 2. So here's interface Ethernet 00. It's a member of VLAN 2 and it's not shut down, so it means it's up, right? So that interface is up, and then Ethernet 01 through 07 are still members of VLAN 1, and all of those ports are up. But let's take a look here now. We now have interface VLAN 2. It's named outside, right? This is our outside interface. Security level is going to be 0 by default, and that is what we want, because that is the interface to which I would connect my Comcast, my Verizon, my Cox cable connection. And here's the key. This is what I love about the factory default setting. IP address DHCP set route, which means that if I'm using Comcast or I'm using Verizon or Cox Cable or whoever it may be, is I can take their connection, plug it right into the firewall, into interface Ethernet 00, and I'm going to get an IP address and a default route from the DHCP server. Again, this is if we don't have a static IP. If you've got a static IP, then of course we're going to have to make some changes. But the basic setting would be, hey, I've contracted with Verizon, whoever the service provider may be. We plug it in and we get the IP address as well as our default route. Then we've got interface VLAN 1. It's the inside. And it's set to the highest security setting, which is 100. Now, quick note, by default, traffic can flow from a higher level security zone or interface, in this case, the inside, to the outside, a lower level interface. And we'll see what that looks like. And so you can see here again, we're 192.168.1.0/24. The security level is set, and the interface is not shut down. In other words, it's up. So here we have a very interesting piece of configuration, and we'll talk about this more, but this factory default setting auto-magically sets me up for port address translation or dynamic NAT overload. And it's setting it up on that inside interface going to the outside, right? So that's what this is saying is we're going to we're doing NAT overload here, or PAT, port address translation, from the inside network to the outside network. It's dynamic NAT, which is, again, NAT overload using the interface IP address on the outside interface. And by default, when you get your Comcast or your Verizon router, right, if you don't have static IPs that you've purchased, the simplest configuration is they bring you the router, they plug it in, and this is really what it's doing, right? It's basically doing port address translation, allowing anybody on the inside to go out. But you'll notice that we don't see anything allowing traffic back. And again, this is kind of going to cross that line, and when we talk about that modular policy framework and the inspection engines. And so we'll talk about that when we get there. Again, we just want to make sure that we talk about the basic config right now that's going to set us up. You can see that we've got the HTTP server is enabled. And here is a statement that's basically stating that anyone on the 192.168.1.0, so in other words, anyone on the inside network can go ahead and bring up the ASDM, right? That ASA device manager software. We've got DHCP configured. You can see it did all this for us. So if we've got people plugging into ports in that 192.168.1, or I should say plugging into the ports, they're going to get a DHCP address, and the base license limits me to, it looks like what, 21 addresses here or 31 addresses. So we're limited to the number of addresses that we could use for DHCP, right? There's that DHCP auto config outside, tied in with the, and let me scroll back up here, and where are we at? I'm looking for that outside interface. I think I went right by it down here below. Again, I was looking for that IP DHCP, oh, here it is, the IP address DHCP set route command, right? And that's what we're doing here is we're turning DHCP-D on for auto config on the outside. We're enabling DHCP on the inside interface. We've got some logging that's going to take place if we wanted to look at the log at the informational level. So again, severity level 6 or higher, but numerically lower. Higher in terms of severity, numerically lower in terms of the severity number that's associated with, like, you have informational at 6, notification at 5, warning at 4, right? So the numbers get lower as the severity increases. And so that's it. That is our factory default configuration. So let's go ahead and say show interface IP brief, and let's see, what do we see here? So again, VLAN 1, right now it's down, down. VLAN 2 is also down, down. So we don't have anything set up to provide DHCP addressing, at least not yet. And so really all we have here is a basic configuration to where if I plugged a host into any of these ports here, let's say, we'll say 0, 2 through 7, which are all in VLAN 1, that would come up and we would be receiving a DHCP address starting at 192.168.1.5. And that gives us this basic configuration. And again, if I had a service provider plugged in on Ethernet, and what was that, 02, if I'm not mistaken, no, I'm sorry, Ethernet 00, right? If we were plugged in on Ethernet 00, we would go ahead and receive that DHCP information from the provider. All right, so now we've looked at 2 ways to get some configuration set here. We've looked at the first, which is basically to go ahead and follow the prompts, right? Again, that's very, very basic just to get us connectivity to the ASA. Then we looked at the factory default configuration approach. It's going to give us that very familiar 192.168.1 on the inside. It's going to configure the outside interface Ethernet 00 for DHCP. So theoretically, I could start plugging things in and we would be looking good. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, if you're familiar with this factory default configuration, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, hold on, Travis. I don't see any access lists. And what did we also not see here? If I say show run, what did we also not see here that we saw with, that we haven't seen yet? So again, no access lists here at all, right? So the question becomes, is traffic going to be allowed to go from the inside to the outside? And again, we'll tackle that here shortly. So if I transition back, now let's talk about the third method, right? Starting from scratch via the command line or the CLI. Now, obviously, if you're just beginning, this is going to have the highest level of difficulty because all of those commands, or a lot of those commands that we saw over on the factory default configuration, you're going to have to know what those commands are, right? In other words, you're going to have to know those commands to be able to enter them in at the CLI. Now, this obviously is going to give me the highest level of customization because we're not locked into that factory default setup. And you may be asking, well, what about the GUI? I want to see the GUI. So there are certain things, and again, I'm Not a fan of the GUIs, right? I much prefer the command line interface, especially when we're talking about remote administration. But there are some things, and I can tell you right now that when we get into the site-to-site VPN, right, or the remote access VPN, that the graphical user interface can be your best friend. However, initial configuration type tasks to get us up and going, this is probably the better way to approach things is from the CLI to learn what exactly it is that's taking place. If you're making changes in the GUI, what are those commands? What does it look like from the CLI? So let's go ahead now, and we're going to actually transition firewalls here as well, right? So we're going to come over to this firewall right here. And we do not want to walk through the interactive prompt. So when you say no, take a look at what happens here. We get the Cisco ASA prompt. We'll go from user exec to privilege exec. If I say show run, right, we got the basic ASA host name, right? It's Cisco ASA. The enable password is not set. All of the interfaces are shut down, right? The VLAN 1 has no name, no security level, no IP address. So again, we're sort of starting here from bare bones with nothing set. But let me come down a little further. And so here again, right, even when you go bare bones, take a look at what you've got. You've got this default global policy, right? This modular policy framework that lists out a number of inspection engines. And I want you to keep that in mind, right? So here we go. And we've got that service policy, right? This global service policy. And what that global means, and we'll talk more about this with the modular policy framework, but I want to touch on it right here, is that that applies to every interface on the ASA, right? So here we are. We've got nothing configured. Well, let's go ahead and set up some of the configuration that we're going to need, and we'll go into global config. We'll say no, and you don't get prompted with that every single time. It's only the first time we get into configure things. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's configure interface VLAN 2. And again, if you were to say, well, hey, I can't remember what we had configured, and this is kind of the nice thing here with the factory default, is you could always come back over here, right? Or you could look at the factory default, cut and paste it, hold on to it, and we could save some time, right? I could simply grab this information because I know that VLAN 2 is going to be my outside interface. The security level, that's going to get put in by default. And I'm going to say, sure, let's do IP address DHCP set route. So we can just drop that information right in there. And you can see it said, you know, security by default is going to be 0. Whoops. Give it a quick no shut. Interface Ethernet 0, 0, and I'm going to say switch port access VLAN. Now remember, not VLAN 1, but VLAN 2, which is my outside interface. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say no shut, right? So let's see what we've got right now. If I was to say show run interface, VLAN 2, that's what it looks like. Show run interface Ethernet 0, 0, and that's what we have. So the interface is not shut down. Now, did we get a DHCP address? Because on this ASA, on Ethernet 0, 0, there is a Cisco 2911 router that's pretending to be the internet service provider, whether it's Verizon or Comcast. So what about do show interface IP brief? Whoops, and it's no show. Show interface IP brief. And let's get some typos out of there. And take a look at that. So we did pick up a DHCP address. And this is the range that I set up over on the 2911, right? So that we could kind of simulate, hey, you know, I'm plugging my Comcast or my Verizon connection in, and boom, take a look at that. We've got an IP address, right? So there it is, right? Can we ping that IP to, or let's say the default gateway is, I think I did 254. So 209.165.200.250, or did I do 1? I can't remember. So it's not working, right? So we're generating this traffic off of the ASA. And let me check 254. There we go. So I used 254. In fact, I probably could have come over here and said, show IP interface brief, and yeah, 254 is our IP address there. So here we are, we've got a DHCP address, and I can ping to the 209.165.200.254. Now, I also have a host on the inside, right? I've got a Apple MacBook, a very old MacBook, hanging off the inside interface, and we're going to use that to simulate the traffic, the transit traffic. And the reason I called this out, and I said that it's being generated by the ASA, is that by default, that traffic is not inspected, right? So the pings are working now, but wait and see what happens here as we kind of move along. All right, so let's get into interface VLAN 1, because if I were to say show interface VLAN 1, or show run interface VLAN 1, remember we didn't have anything configured here. So we're in interface VLAN 1, we have to name it, right? If we don't name it, the interface will not be operational. So we're going to keep it simple. We're going to call it inside. Now by default, the inside interface, which is your trusted, protected network, the security level will be set to 100. That is the highest setting. And so by default, traffic can go from a higher level interface to a lower security level interface, but not the other way around. So by default, traffic could go from the inside to the outside, right? So here's what we're going to do on the inside. I'm going to say we've got the security level of 100. So here's where it's going to get a little different, right? I'm not going to stick with that 192 setup because, again, my local network, and I'm going to have to remote display this MacBook with that 192 address that it has. So we're going to say IP address is going to be 10.0.0.254. Right? So that's my inside IP. And now I've hard-coded an IP address onto a 10 dot address onto that MacBook. That's on that inside interface. Now, we've got the VLAN configured, and I keep saying do. So show run interface VLAN 1. And so then we've got VLAN 1 configured on the inside. So I could actually plug this interface into a switch, right? And if on that switch, I've got everything in the same VLAN, then I could plug in 20, 30, 40 different hosts, and they would all be coming through this inside interface, and they would all be considered on the inside of my network. So if I was to draw out what we have right now, so here is the ISP router that's providing DHCP, and this is my ASA. Here's Ethernet 00, right? So we're connected into the ISP, and we'll do this in red, and this is my outside, right? It's on the outside of what I want to be my protected inside network, which will reflect in green, right? So here is my inside interface. And again, the security level on this guy is 100. The security level here is 0 because it's the lowest. So I actually just have a MacBook that I'm plugging in here. But what could you do, right? Theoretically, if the 7 remaining ports, right, after we use this Ethernet 00, if the 7 remaining ports aren't enough, I can plug this into an Ethernet switch, right? And maybe this is a 48 port Ethernet switch. And then you could plug, right, your servers, your laptops, whatever you wanted. Maybe you've got some access points, right, that you're trying to work with. If you've got APs, and again, this is the protected inside network. But again, our setup is simply just a Mac, and we are plugged into that inside interface, and I hard-coded the IP, and when we get into the DHCP, we already saw how we could set that up, and we'll set it up as well, but I chose to hard-code the address on here. And so this is what we have right now, right? We've got this inside interface, we've got the outside interface, we've got an IP address here. We're going to set the IP here, and this would be your layer 3 boundary, or could be if you wanted it to be. This could be a layer 2 switch, right? With just literally, you could throw a single VLAN on there, plug it in here, and off you go, right? Excuse me. So at that point, we plug in and we've got connectivity, and we would be able to speak. We've got some additional settings we're going to have to put on here in order to allow us to actually work with the ASA, and we'll see what that looks like here in a second. But for right now, this is what we've got, right? So I wanted to talk about this because I plugged directly in. And again, remember, we have additional interfaces that are in VLAN 1 that we could plug into, and that would work fine. Remember, this ASA 5505, this is a small office, home office, maybe a remote office ASA. It's not meant to plug in 60, 70, 80 hosts. If you're going to do something like that, you'd want to be looking at something like a switch to hang off of that inside port. All right, so we've got the inside interface configured, but what do we need to do now? Yeah, we need to, we got the VLAN configured. We want to get into that Ethernet 01, and this is where we want to say switch port access VLAN 1. Now remember, that's the default. I don't have to type that, but get into the habit of typing that in just to make sure you don't forget if you're going to do other zones, right, or other security, or put interfaces into other VLANs. If we wanted to do a DMZ and put some web servers in there, we would make that VLAN 3. So again, it's not going to show in the config, and it's already defaulted that, but it's a good habit to get into. And we're going to say no shut. So what do we have now? So let's take a look. We started from scratch. We've got Ethernet 00. You can see the switch port access VLAN 2, and that's one of those tricky things, right? It shows up here for VLAN 2, but you may look at this at first blush and say, well, where's the switch port access VLAN 1 I just typed in? Remember, that is the default, so the Cisco show run, and you're not going to see that. And interface Ethernet 01 is up. So now let's see, I'm going to cross my fingers here that this is going to work, and we're going to do this. So I'm going to try to remote to the 10.0.0.10, and it doesn't look like it likes that, and I think I may have to say, it's got a I'm sorry, I wanted to go to the 192.168.1.139. I apologize there. I didn't need all that. Didn't need the 10. No, it doesn't like that. So what I'm trying to do right now is connect to, and there it is. Okay. So the password, which I think that might be the password. Okay, fantastic. So here we are, right? So we're on this MacBook Pro, it's not a MacBook Pro, sorry, just this MacBook here. And this is the local shell. So I'm going to say Control-C. And let's see, can I ping the 10.0.0.254? So take a look at that. And again, remember, this MacBook is plugged directly in to interface Ethernet 01. And I can ping the inside interface of the ASA. And I'm using that, this 10.0.0.254, on this MacBook, right? And if you had hosts that you had plugged in, whether it's a switch or directly plugged in, and I don't want to see that, whether it's a switch or directly plugged in, that is your default gateway. The firewall in this instance, because we don't have a router on the inside of our network somewhere, this is your layer 3 device. And so you would use it just like you would a default router. So I get my traffic to the ASA. The ASA has a default route that it has received from that DHCP server. In fact, on the ASA, if I was to say, let's get the command back, show IP route, or was it show route IP? Show route. And there we go. And so, again, syntax, excuse me, show IP route for iOS. It's a little different here on the ASA, so it's just show route. But take a look at what we've got, right? There is the entry that we need. If we can just get the traffic to the ASA, right? So all of your hosts You would set their default route to be that IP address on the inside interface, and then that traffic will arrive at the ASA, and the ASA says, yeah, I've got a quad 0 default setup here. It's via 209.165.200.254, which is that, we'll say the ISP router, and what interface or out which interface is that traffic going to travel? It's out the outside interface. And that is that default route setup. And again, you would be getting the default route from the service provider as well. And so now let's go ahead, and this is where we're going to be taking a look at, can I ping the 209.165.200.254? That's interesting, right? So now we're probably scratching our heads saying, well, that doesn't make any sense, because you could ping it from the firewall, and you just told me, Travis, that traffic from a higher level interface, higher security level interface, is allowed by default to go to a lower security level interface. And whoops, sorry, I didn't want to do that there. And that's absolutely true. However, there are going to be some caveats that we're going to have to deal with. So right now, this is not going to work, okay? And let me go ahead here and get rid of the pen there. Didn't want to pull the pen tool up. So it's not working right now. But if I come to the firewall and I say ping 209.165.200.254, it works, right? So remember this, keep this in mind, that it's not going to work. Whoops, I'll bring that back, the remote. Not going to work right now, right? But we are going to get it to work. But we're going to have to wait until we scoot a little deeper down the configuration rabbit hole here with the ASA. So we've got connectivity from our inside host, and if, again, we were plugged into a switch and everybody's in the same VLAN, and we're all pointing toward that inside interface, right? They would all be able to ping that inside interface. So now let's do this. So the factory default settings, right? So we're going to kind of digress here. When we did that factory default, these are the things that are going to be set, and this is what they're going to be set to. VLAN 1, which is your inside, VLAN 2 is your outside. You get port address translation configured, right? NAT overload set up for you auto-magically on the outside interface. We get the default route via DHCP. We saw that that worked. We have no access from the outside to the inside, right? And in fact, right now, we were unable to ping. I want to specify we couldn't ping to the outside, right? So DHCP is configured for inside hosts using the address range 192.168.1.5 to .36. We saw that. HTTP access is allowed. ASA hostname was just Cisco ASA. There's no console or enable passwords. And an ACL is going to be required for inside. I've got a little asterisk here, and we're going to get to this in one of the future modules, right? So you'll notice that I couldn't ping, even when I went in and did it manually by myself, I still couldn't get inside to outside connectivity with ping, right? So and this is the factory default that I'm talking about. So on that factory default, right, we would have to take some additional steps. And again, we will definitely get to those because we have to, because we're going to be doing remote access VPN. We're going to want to ping, things like that, to the outside internet. And so that's when we get into that modular policy framework, which is going to complement and give us that stateful, right, that stateful awareness of the ASA firewall. Okay, so this is going to conclude Module 3, right? We talked about 3 different ways that we can get some basic configuration onto the ASA. We can do simply follow the prompts, right? And enter in the information that we would like. We can do the factory default configuration, which is also a great way to get started. And then third and final, if we don't like that factory default, right, we can start from scratch. Or you could do a combination. I could do the factory default and then go in and change any information that I wanted to change, right? If I wasn't happy with the inside IP address range, I could change those things. Okay, so this is going to wrap up Module 3, and it's going to lead us into Module 4, where we're now going to start to dig in and get into much more detail with the ASA in terms of the configuration piece. And we're now going to start to see connectivity is going to be stood up. All right, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next module.